The first session for today is going to involve a little bit of empirical background. We're going to start with just some very basic introspection. I'm going to show you some pairs of phrases and just note to yourself which one sounds more natural to you. Sounds like the way you'd say it. And I think this is going to be obvious. So here we go. Pepper and salt, salt and pepper. Which way would you say it? Which sounds more natural? You probably think that the ordering salt and pepper sounds more natural. Most people say that, whether they're native English speakers or even just have a lot of experience in English. Let's go to the second example. Cat and mouse, mouse and cat. This one probably feels even more obvious. Obviously, cat and mouse. I've made the circle around it a little thicker to illustrate that that's surely a very strong intuition that you have. Here we go. Skirts and sweaters, sweaters and skirts. If you're like many people, you don't have a particularly strong ordering preference in this case, so I'll just sort of illustrate this with equal weights here, sort of two thin circles. And likewise, if I ask many people to just force to choose one, then what we'll find is a pretty even balance of which one people choose. Next one. Bishops and seamstresses, seamstresses and bishops. Most of you will probably prefer bishops and seamstresses, but it's not as strong a preference as salt and pepper or cat and mouse. Few and unfavorable, unfavorable and few. Probably few and unfavorable. And probably the last one. We'll see what you have an intuition about. Interest and principle or principle and interest. You probably think it's principle and interest. And hopefully you'll agree that not only do you share the intuitions by and large that I'm expressing on the screen here, because these are coming from empirical data, both how these expressions are used, and also when I ask people introspectively, what do people tend to say? But also that the strength of your preference also sort of goes with the thickness of the lines here. So this is the strength of preference is actually something that sort of is gradient. It has different levels of intensity. Now, these are what are called binomial expressions, expressions of the form x and y. And every occurring binomial expression is a result of what we can think of as a speaker's choice about binomial ordering. It's not a choice that you usually are making consciously, although occasionally it may enter into your conscious deliberation. But most of the time when you're speaking, you don't think about every particular word and how you're going to say it and how you're going to arrange it in relation to the other words. It just comes out. But something in your mind is making that choice. And what we're going to talk about today is the principles underlying that ordering preference for this particular one case, binomials. So I'm going to next turn to just actually not only what do you introspectively feel is more natural, but also let's just look at the patterns of usage. So what I've got here is data from about 340 billion words of English, which is several orders of magnitude larger than a human lifetime's worth of language experience. And this is from what's called the Google Books project. I'll tell you about that more in a moment. But this is from 1960 and on. It's from books in the United States published in English. And so remarkably, from these kinds of data, you can get counts of how often there's now large enough, well-digitized, well-indexed data sets that you can look up how often the expression salt and pepper was used and compared to the frequency of pepper and salt. It's reverse. So in the case of salt and pepper, 569,000 times in that order, and in the reverse order, only 32,000 times. So something in the order of like 95% of the time it occurs in the salt and pepper order. Cat and mouse is maybe even more extreme. 27,000 versus 1/3 of 1,000. Skirts and sweaters, you can see, is remarkably equibiased. Bishops and seamstresses and few and unfavorable are interesting. Neither of them occurs in these corpora, and they are infrequent enough and constructed intentionally by us as researchers, so that it's highly improbable that you've heard both orders in your lifetime, and quite likely that you haven't heard either order in your lifetime. So these are examples with which you don't have direct experience. Nevertheless, you probably felt that you had both preferences. You probably preferred bishops and seamstresses over seamstresses and bishops. And differing strengths of preferences. You probably favored few and unfavorable over unfavorable and few even more strongly. And so on and so forth. And principle and interest is somewhere in between. It's not a super strong ordering preference, but it's definitely more common in the principle and interest ordering, and that's probably what you felt as well. So we can actually see the reflection of your introspective preferences actually in the corpus statistics themselves. So this raises a number of interesting questions. What is the representation of these ordering preferences? And are these preferences productive? In the sense that you can, which ones and how can you deploy in cases that you've actually never heard before. You've heard salt and pepper before in your lifetime. You've never heard bishops and seamstresses before I showed it to you today. So clearly there's something about the source of these preferences that is productive. But what are those things and how are they productive? So a little bit about the Google Books corpus. This is the corpus itself is millions of digitized books. The process here was that that Google, sort of starting in the early 2000s, partnered with university libraries and started doing massive large-scale scanning of complete books. And the estimate at this point is that there's something extraordinarily like maybe 10 to 15% of all the books in the world in the history of publishing got digitized and scanned and automatized, and n-gram statistics for n equals 1, n equals 2, n equals 3, n equals 4, and n equals 5 have been recorded, indexed both by n-gram and by year, and statistics, data are collected about them. This was a highly, sort of a high-profile article in Science in 2011, and you may be familiar with the Google Ngrams Viewer, which you can actually access on the web easily, and it affords all sorts of very straightforward, but very flexible and powerful visualizations and explorations. So, for example, it turns out that if you go and look at this, that although the expression salt and pepper is vastly more common now and today in English than pepper and salt, actually, if you go back to the mid-19th century, it wasn't that way at all. In fact, if anything, there was maybe a stronger preference for pepper and salt. You can also look at this cross-linguistically, and I encourage you to do that and explore it. You can learn an amazing amount by these cases of binomial ordering expressions, as well as many other facts about language use through this n-grams dataset. Now, let's move away from the corpus situation and test intuitions on words that are not even real words. So this is one of the first experimental papers on the study of these expressions and in general on the role of phonological principles in preferences by native speakers. So I'm going to give you some more examples, and once again, I want you to just think about your own intuitions about them. The first one, which order sounds more natural? Boof and kaboof or kaboof and boof? And that may sound silly, but you probably find that you actually have a preference, and it's probably boof and kaboof. Let's try another one. Glaggy and gliggy or gliggy and glaggy? Once again, both of them are absurd, but you actually probably prefer gliggy and glaggy. Let's try another one. Swerp and swir, swir and swerp. You probably don't have a strong preference for one or the other, and if you do, it's not that likely to be shared with your friend. How about this? Smates and smats, smats and smates. Smats and smates is probably your preference. Rasby and dasby, dasby and rasby. You probably prefer rasby and dasby. Now, underlying each of these contrasts, once again, none of these words that I'm showing you are ones that you use on an everyday basis, or even possibly with any frequency at all. They're, by intention, they're constructed as nonce words. They don't exist. But they are possible words of English. Now, each of these ordering pairs highlights a contrast of some feature that involves the shape, the sound pattern of the word. And these are 5 different features that Pinkerton Birdsong looked at. So the first one is word length. So you can think of the first example, boof kaboof, as a shorter word before a longer word, kaboof and boof. The second one is about vowel quality. So you have a high front vowel, I, and then a back and more low vowel, a. And do you prefer high to low, front to back, or low to high, back to front? And it seems like you prefer high to low. Number of final consonants, swir has only one final consonant, swerp has 2, and p. Smats and smates, a is what we call a short vowel, a is a long vowel. The duration is longer, and also a is what's called a diphthong. It begins as e and becomes e, a. And finally, rasby and dasby, dasby and rasby. D is an obstruent. You're familiar with obstruents. There's more blockage of the vocal tract, an airflow to create the consonant. And so it seems that you prefer to have a less obstruent consonant. And these are just examples, but let's look more generally at the ordering preferences that were found for Pinkerton Birdsong. So here's their key graph. So on the x-axis, we have the 5 different categories of phonological generalization, those 5 things that I was pointing out. And on the y-axis, we have the mean preference in one direction or the other. And this is set up so that 3 means indifferent. I don't care which ordering you choose. Above 3 is that the phonologically motivated pattern, like short before long, is preferred. And below would be phonologically motivated order is just preferred. And I'll focus just on the native speakers line, which is the solid line. This is an old graph. Ideally, we would have, we would have error bars and so forth. But even back then, we saw quite a strong preference, which is that, first of all, the word length effect is very robust, and you didn't even need to be a native speaker to have it. But there were a number of these other phenomena, the vowel quality, vowel length, and initial consonant obstruency, which did reliably show up as being preferred for native speakers, and you are likely to actually have had, to some degree, to feel that preference yourself in the examples that I gave. So to just go through this, again, this is previous work on novel binomials, that is nonce binomials, ones that have been never used before. So we saw with these nonce word binomials, we saw that there are length effects, there are vowel quality effects, there are vowel length effects, there are initial consonant effects, and final consonant effects don't occur to show up, although there was a reason to hypothesize that they would. So that's why we do empirical science. We discover things that don't always hold. There's also been work on using novel binomials with familiar words. Okay, so for example, bishops and seamstresses is an example of that. And this dates back at least to MacDonald et al. 1993, and they did things like asking people which one sounds more naturally, or just to take two things and just put them in a sentence using the word and see which order that people use them in. And they found, for example, that people preferred to put animate words that refer to animate things like deer before words that refer to inanimate things like trees. They didn't find word length effects, although in interpretation there are very, in sort of which one sounds better, there are very strong word length effects. So this is some earlier work, and there's been a great deal of work on trying to understand the nature of these constraints in greater detail. References to that literature I have here, and it's sort of distilled down more recently into a set of constraints which I'm going to give to you now. And so the first one is what we might call, the first several are semantic constraints. They have to do with the meanings of the words. And the first of those, and this is by far the most powerful constraint of all, is iconic and scalar sequencing. And we might think about it in the following way. When we're talking about things that come in some kind of natural order, the mapping between the order in which you utter words and the order in which the events that are being referred to would occur has to be the same. It's first uttered, first event. And think about that. Although it's intuitive, that's not a necessary property of language. And it's not even always the case. So at the clause level, for example, I could say something like, I bought the bottle of soda after I entered the store. I can use the word after to signal that the first event is actually in the reverse temporal ordering of the utterances. But at this level of just putting words together with the word and, it seems that this iconic preference is very, very strong. So for example, if to say open and read a book, I opened and read the book is perfectly natural. Think about reversing that. Suppose I said, I read and opened the book. That's so powerful that it probably conjures into your mind the possibility of me somehow reading the contents of the book without opening it. Reading maybe all the contents on the cover and then I open it afterwards or something like that. That's one example. Hit and run. In an auto accident, you get hit first and then you run. And then the person who does the hitting runs. But actually all of the constraints, all these preferences that I'm going to talk about here are violable. That means that there are examples in language which will be exceptions. So these are violable constraints, and an important project that we're going to be looking at is how do we formalize that notion of viability and variable constraint strength. So an example, it's very hard to find exceptions to this iconic scalar sequencing constraint, but here's one. Hit and run. If you know baseball, you know that the hit and run play is a play where the batter, so normally in baseball, of course, the batter hits the ball, then there's a run. If there's a runner on base, the runner runs. Usually the batter hits the ball first and then the runner runs. The hit and run play is when the runner runs first, a little bit early, to get a head start. And it's a risky play because if the batter doesn't successfully hit the ball, the runner is vulnerable. But the hit and run play is one, despite the name, hit and run, it's actually the running that happens first, and then the hitting happens. So this is an exception to the rule. Perceptual markedness is a second semantic constraint. It basically says that animate or concrete or positive things, words that refer to things with these properties, tend to come before words that refer to things that don't have these properties. So for example, people introspectively prefer deer and tree a lot of the time over trees and deer. Honest and stupid sounds better than stupid and honest. And an example of an exception is flora and fauna. So flora is less animate in a sort of the hierarchy of animacy than fauna, but nevertheless, flora and fauna is a pretty common usage. Power, we can think of as sort of the cultural prioritization of words. And this includes things like higher social prestige, unfortunately being male instead of relative to being female or of other genders. That's historically present in our society, and that actually influences word ordering preferences. And many other things. So, for example, the example of bishops and seamstresses, actually, that ordering preference is partly probably implicating the fact that bishops are stereotypically male and seamstresses are stereotypically female. But there are other reasons for that constraint, for that example that we'll get into later on. Other examples are cases like clergymen and parishioners. So clergymen are higher prestige than the parishioners. Food and drinks. So the food is sort of more culturally central in the meal. Clerks and postmasters is an exception. Clerks are lower prestige than the postmasters. They're lower in the social order. In fact, actually, the food and drinks is a really interesting example. That's an example of what's known as the condiment rule. That's sort of the nickname that it's been given in the literature. So other examples of the condiment rule are you say burger and fries rather than fries and burger. You might say ham and eggs rather than eggs and ham. And it even is the basis of jokes, because when you flout the ordering preference, you can create irony and humor. So whereas I might say coffee and sugar to mean I'm having sugar with the coffee, if you say, would you like some coffee with that sugar? Then that's because normally you think of the sugar being secondary and the coffee coming first. And that's the same conceptualization in our minds that underlies the coffee and sugar ordering preference. One more semantic-oriented constraint is the formal markedness. Words that have more general or broader meaning distributions tend to come before words that have more narrow distributions. So sewing and quilting, quilting is a type of sewing. And so it's more common to say sewing first and then quilting. Changing and improving. Improving is a kind of changing, so you usually say changing and improving, not improving and changing. But there are exceptions to this. So for example, you'll often encounter roses and flowers, even though roses are a kind of flower. Those are the meaning-based constraints. Now we can move on to the other constraints that we've sort of gotten, and this is going to be a little less fine-grained than the ones that we looked at for the nonce words, but this is a sort of useful sort of overall packaging. No final stress. So the final syllable of the second word in an X and Y coordination must not be stressed. So abused and neglected is preferred to neglected and abused because neglected and abused ends in a final stress. Skirts and sweaters over sweaters and skirts. Manufacture and install over install and manufacture. Manufacture and install is an exception because install is final stress. Word frequency. The more frequent words comes first. You can think of this as a lexical constraint. Bride and groom over groom and bride. Smile and wink over wink and smile. Psychiatrists and patients is an exception. Probably it's an exception because of the power constraint. Psychiatrists are more powerful than patients. So even though it's a more frequent word, patients, it's less likely to come first. And then finally, length, or Panini's law. Panini, by the way, was a wonderful, sort of, in a sense, the first linguist that we know of. Panini was a scholar in India in ancient times and actually wrote a grammar of Sanskrit. And Panini's work is looked upon very favorably by linguists today. Panini's law says that shorter words should come before longer words, and we see this all over the place. So ask and answer, tense and irritable. But of course, there are exceptions to this too, like family and friends, which was a 2-syllable word before a 1-syllable word. So we have all of these examples. I've shown you many specific cases, gotten your intuition primed, hopefully. And what we're going to do next is we're going to look at how to formalize this idea of these multiple cross-cutting ordering preferences and talk about their varying strengths, and then look at a quantitative model of that sort of ordering preference determination.